Persona 3 is perhaps one of the most influential games for its company. It's what drove to the gameplay formula of their most sold game of all time, and at least to me it sort of holds a special place in my heart, where I can see the game has flaws, yet at the same time I still like it. Yeah, I dislike how lengthy it is and how much it drags at times, but I had already gotten used to that since this wasn't my favorite game in the franchise, and it wasn't even my first one to begin with. I literally started my Atlus RPG journey with Persona 1, and it's a game I still hold dear to this day, in some regards closer to me than Persona 3. A lot of the elements of dungeon crawling in that game to me just felt right, even though at times it felt like a slog. Its deep characters and complex plot points about morality and power are some of the highlights of the series for me, and the music that stays with you the entire time just makes it very much welcome and builds the atmosphere for tackling such subjects. Now, Atlus remastered this and slapped it on the PSP with an inferior version of the OST, which not only was an awful way to disrespect the composers that worked on it, but it was also a big middle finger to the soundtrack the late Hidehito Aoki worked on, and who personally had some of the best regarded music featured in the entire game and even in the entire series. A lot of it was scrapped in favor of Persona 4-esque, more pop-feeling music, which frankly doesn't fit the vibe at all, and even the battle theme in some regards feels alien to what it used to be.
Valid memory, experience self-consciousness. I'm just love player.
While the PS1 version feels in some regards fitting of the hectic and random encounter vibe of the game, the PSP just misses the entire point by adding lyrics to it, which after 1, 2, 3, 4, even 10 encounters lose their effect at all. Not to mention that for the type of game that this is, it feels like the soundtrack just got power washed and a way weaker instrumentation got thrown into the bunch, which really doesn't help the way it feels. It's filled with random encounters and it has that sort of classic RPG vibe that doesn't suit the modern style of doing songs. I'm bringing this all up because a lot of it has to do with what has been stylistically brought upon the Reload remake as well. I'll get to that in a bit. It's not only related to music, trust me. For the next PSP remakes, they did learn from their mistake, however, when going through the remake of Persona 2 to be more exact, both Innocent Sin and Eternal Punishment, since they specifically gave you the option to use classic music instead of remixed versions this time around. The PSP version for Persona 1 specifically had entirely new tracks for almost everything, and in my opinion to its detriment. A lot of the cool moments like Awakenings entirely lost their soundtrack, which got completely removed from the PSP versions, and even entire character themes, which frankly I don't think there was a need for them to remove that. It felt lazy at times, but one thing to note is that Atlus does not have a good track record of remixing tracks. They at times miss entirely the original intent of the song, something that is extremely apparent in this PSP version, not only of Persona 1 but of Persona 2 as well. First, I'd like to exemplify a few of those moments. I'll present the Awakenings in Persona 1 in both versions to start, and then I'll move on to some lightning round song comparisons from both Persona 1 and 2 to show off what I mean exactly. Actually, you know what? Scrap the lightning round. I've made my point already. I need to move on to the main topic and the reason you clicked this video. And that is... I think a lot of the choices and changes in the new Persona 3 remake not only feel contradictory to the game's overall aesthetic and presentation, but they feel out of place. And a lot of the content cuts genuinely think like they shouldn't have been made at all. So I wanted to talk about this in hopes we see an improvement of the way things are currently. I genuinely love what I've played of this game, but I cannot recommend it in good faith, knowing a superior version of it, at least content-wise and presentation-wise, exists out there. Yes, that is part of my take on it, but don't take my word for granted. This is quite literally an opinionated review. I've decided to split into chapters in order to speak about every single aspect of this port's shortcomings. First of all, I did an entire segue from the start mentioning both Persona 1 and 2 and their respective remakes, which have been mostly improvements in a lot of regards. But they felt like one step forwards, one step backwards in others. Previously I had only mentioned the music of those, but I feel the need to accentuate the fact Persona 2 Innocent Sin made the dungeon crawling much more of a slog by removing the ability entirely to give the characters orders they can repeat. But there's also good aspects like the streamlining of the overall map Persona 1 did. They sort of end up coming up like mixed bags that have rather noticeable faults, and Persona 3 Reload does sort of the exact same thing in more than one place. Let's take it all one at a time. I'll start by going over the small parts first, heading into gameplay changes next, and at last discussing presentation. So what's the small stuff? Well, the small stuff is not small either, it's actually one of the most significant aspects of the entire video. To begin with, the DLC expansion The Answer got cut from the base game and will be coming later as DLC from what I understand and from all the sources I've read. I don't mind that much not including the answer in the base game by default, but the problem is this is a $70 game that you're probably paying at least $10 more to get the same content that used to be on the Fest disc. And I see that as a problem, to be honest. Since Atlus has essentially been made a Sega subsidiary, I just have a feeling the DLC might even be priced at $30, which would not only be an awful punch to the face of the community, I just don't feel it's right. You could argue the $70 price tag is justified because this is a full-on remake, but I disagree and I'll provide the points I'm following later. Let's talk about the actual price of the deluxe edition as well, which comes in at just $100 for a few skins, some reused music from other Persona games, and the game's OST in a DRM filled EXE format. As well as the art book, which is also in the same fucking goddamn format, so you just don't own anything you're buying essentially, from this quote-unquote deluxe edition. What a fucking joke, Sega, to be honest. This is horrible. This is like the worst way to buy a collector's edition and the worst things you could get, because you can't access any of the music or the images on there actually. They're just like exe files. Last piece of sort of minor complaint that doesn't even have a lot to do with the quality of the game itself, but cut content, is the removal of the entire female route that was present in the portable version of the game, and a straight up refusal to even acknowledge it. While I personally think the female route goes against a lot of the game's themes with some of the changes to the main narrative, not really related to the gender part of it, but more the story aspects, which I'd mention if they weren't this spoilery for a remake that just released. I think the option would have been greatly appreciated, and I personally know a lot of folks which really miss the option, essentially locking a big chunk of content on an obsolete version of your game, not to mention announcing that it doesn't even have a chance of ever coming as DLC. I'm guessing this is as good a time as ever to talk about all the cut content and gameplay changes of the remake. Starting off strong, the ability to break social links has been entirely removed. This mechanic had been largely altered in the portable port of Persona 3, but the way it's outright removed here baffles me. Yeah, none of the games after this in the entire series adopted it, but it was something that made 3 in particular stand out. Yes, it did cause at times unnecessary stress, but it was an extremely fun way of doing the social link mechanic. mostly because it was close to impossible to break them, and it totally made sense from a realistic standpoint that not spending time with a person or being an asshole would end up upsetting them, and in actual gameplay it was the more fun way of implementing it, mostly because it required actual planning ahead and critical thinking, and when you actually did it you knew it was your fault. This change goes more in line with removing the amount of micromanagement needed in a game that has its soul built around the managing of stats. It just overall results in less actual gameplay and doesn't cut the tedium at all. Speaking of social links, how do you like your options cut out for you? Oh, you wouldn't like character social links variants removed? Well, that's kind of bad because the Kendo, Swim Team, Music and Photography Club social link variants have been removed in Persona 3 Reload, and the Chariot Arcana now forces Track Team and Fortune forces Art Club. This highly changes the way you interact with the clubs at the school and makes it feel weird having your options cut out if you've played previous versions. Not to mention it doesn't really make sense in the definitive version of a game to just straight up cut out this much content. But wait, there is more cut stuff. The removal of the tiredness and sick mechanics and all the other condition mechanics, which feels very strange. Generally your character would get tired during the exploration of Tartarus. This was mostly done to even out the pacing of exploring while forcing the player to make critical decisions in their day-to-day life, and it just worked. It makes perfect sense. Using a tired character for too long would make them sick, so you'd have to plan ahead and play smart, evenly using each character in your party. But this was yet another mechanic that got thrown out in favor of modernizing. Atlus's removal of these mechanics just felt to me like them trying to appeal to the quote-unquote modern audiences, which could not deal with virtual characters disliking them or the sort of punishing condition statuses that were implemented in the original. It feels like the game has lost a big chunk of its personality or soul and what made it unique. But for the most part it just feels like another step into turning the entire series and homogenizing it into Persona 5. Don't get me wrong, Persona 5 is a great game with great vibes and characters, but by no means the highlight of Atlus's best design choices. That's why specifically the battle system from 5 at times feels easily broken by its fast turn system or how easy most fights feel like even on the hardest difficulties. A lot of that has to do with the changes to the one more system from Persona 4 onwards. The system used to only give you one more turn when hitting any enemy with their weakness. Condition was that for multi-target spells, even if you hit the weakness of the enemy, if the others were not weak to it too, they wouldn't get knocked and wouldn't give you an extra turn. This incentivized the use of a single target spell, as well as evening out when the enemies didn't have repel or absorb. This changed in 4, so it gives you one more turn even if not all the enemies were weak to your attack, which was just one of the many changes that got translated to Persona 3 Reload and ended up sort of dumbing down the difficulty by a bit. That and the nerf to fusion spells. Fusion spells are things that were introduced in Persona 2, and the way they used to work was when a player did a combination of specific spells to an enemy with multiple characters on the same turn, they'd get a cool animation and an attack that does significantly more damage. The whole idea was the personas would one-up each other and do a giant attack. This got ported to the original Persona 3, but heavily nerfed. You still required two personas, but they didn't have to be on the two different characters anymore, since your party members in 3 only have one persona for the entire duration of the game. You can only do fusion spells with personas from your stock. It's not as cool as before for that reason alone, but it's still very much functional and requires prior input to balance the fact it doesn't use multiple turns. However, they require a higher SP cost and the need to have both personas in stock. They're both one step forwards, one step backwards. First of all, there's only around 18 of them compared to Persona 2's I think over 60 something. But this time around they also do multiple things that don't directly affect just damaging the enemy, mostly having healing effects or knockdown properties, and even then they're extremely cool because it's sort of an ultra attack you can perform for a large percentage of your SP. In relation to that, Portable was a massive step down from the formula both the original and FES build, turning the fusion spells into items you had to buy with gems from a certain store. It removed a lot of the logic behind why the animation would look like that or why it would have the effects it did. It still made sense in some regards, but not only did it make fusion spells obsolete by requiring you to buy them, it just turned such a simple action into such a tedious way to grind and obtain them, and hid it behind a menu, to be more exact, the items menu. Reload fixes a few of the complaints I've had with the system, but also completely throws it out the window at the same time. First, instead of using SP, the new attacks use a secondary bar named Theurgy skills. The bar fills up while doing actions such as hitting weaknesses, performing melee attacks, and using the persona skills. The gauge carries over after a battle is finished. The gauge is cut in half if the combatant faints and is then revived, while under the effect of an ailment the gauge does not increase and Theurgy skills cannot be used. My main issue with this mechanic is the fact that it takes the already limited pool of about 18 fusion spells and reduces it even further to 7, only including the damaging ones and removing the requirement of having both personas in stock, which frankly feels like a downgrade from a system they could have put a bit more effort into, to add upon instead of removing spells and complicating it all together. Aegis's Orgia mode also got the same treatment, as it's just a one-time use skill using the Theurgy bar and no longer leaves her vulnerable, and instead just makes her ignore actions for a few turns after the attack is performed, removing essentially all the planning ahead you had to do in the original by leaving her open to attacks for a few turns in exchange for insane damage capabilities. But past that, the bar has some advantages. It does give other characters a cool ability specific to them after their persona evolutions, but the trade-off of losing the OG fusion spells just feels wrong personally to me. It might feel like a nitpick, but I genuinely feel like this is a downgrade, like how the social link mechanic was and how the altering of the past turn system was as well. Speaking of the battling system, the place where the exploring goes has seen quite a significant facelift, mostly in the realm of in-game objects getting plastered everywhere throughout the environment, some light animations on most parts of it, and all of these changes are welcome, but the wider corridors make it feel way less claustrophobic than the original version of this dungeon. I think some of the floors feel a bit too large. Apart from that, Tartarus sort of received the Mementos treatment and now has some twisty doors with bosses you can find to get extra loot. It's mostly unchanged for the latter part. I wish there was more here, but yeah, I don't really mind these changes at all, and I mostly think they are positive, but I wish they had done way more. I mean, by that point, why not rework the entirety of Tartarus, since it was the most tedious part of the game in the first place? Personas gameplay-wise aren't all that changed. They introduced new ones from Persona 5, but my problem is they also cut a ton from Persona 3. I can't really say a lot of them come to mind, but from what I've heard there's a minimum of 10 removed, mostly noticeable when you do the big fusions within Iger's Velvet Room. I really don't understand this change once again. It's time to move on to a pill that may be extremely hard to swallow for most fans of the original, and that is stylization. Since I just spoke about personas, I must mention that these aren't really stylized in the quote-unquote new art style and mostly have their models directly pulled from Persona 5. There are probably some new ones that have been graphically enhanced, but most of them still have that PS3 flair to them and look sort of pixelated on the new hardware at times. Battles in Reload also have been altered. They've sort of fucked up the stylization of the all-out attack. No longer does it have the cool cut-ins, and now just flashes to the characters running towards the screen in a completely different scene for some reason. That just creates a bit of confusion, because not only does this scene look like unfinished flat ground, but the original had you directly in the battle scenery and didn't even change the things around you. Not to mention the new volumetric cloud is strangely animated and looks weirdly photorealistic, which really clashes with the anime-esque character models. I really don't think this is an overall upgrade. The fusion spells or Theurgy attacks have also gotten a facelift. Cut-ins are once again removed, which I don't agree with at all, but the overall consensus of it is each one has actual persona combo animations, which are cool. Unfortunately, gameplay-wise, they are not better than the original, and the lack of cut-ins sort of removes the dramatic effect from them. The new UI elements are cool, but in my opinion are way too bright and colorful for the game's overall presentation and are missing a lot of that more washed out style. Looking at it, I think they could have made a compromise between the two styles, because seeing actual UI they developed in the beta just makes me angry. This sort of leaked online and fits the game's overall aesthetic much better than what they ended up going with. So it just sort of pisses me off. Don't get me the wrong way, I like how the new design looks, it's just not tailored specifically for 3 style in my opinion. And this beautification and changing of things that didn't need that much work just goes deeper than that, from the entire art style change all the way to the lighting. The new art style is very strange in my opinion and sort of ruins a lot of the facial expressions and way characters felt. While the old one utilized flatter colors and shading to its advantage, the new one ends up looking sort of generic while having more detailed character portraits. Same way the chat UI looks weirdly out of place in some scene. That's about my opinion with it. My only last issue with it is the flatter lighting, which just straight up looks worse than the original at times and cannot be adjusted. And the fact they locked all the reflections behind ray tracing. That's mostly everything I've said graphics related. Digital Foundry did a great video on this, detailing each aspect that underwent these changes, and I believe you can mostly form your own opinions by just watching that, since this isn't something that's that important. I'll link it down below. As for the soundtrack, I personally think the new songs are all great. They don't feel specifically Persona 3-esque, but they fit great into the roster of already existing songs. And I already have a few of my favorites from this part specifically. My issue comes mostly from reworked songs, which mostly sound much worse than the original, form weaker sounding vocals done by a new vocalist for absolutely no reason, to just straight up worse instrumentation. Let's start with the first. My first question is, if you go through the effort to bring back Lotus Juice, the original rapper, why not also bring back the original vocalist, Yumi Kawamura? Yeah, she's older, but she's still singing, and her replacement in the soundtrack just feels wrong. I feel like the new vocalist does a worse job in most instances.
I've never felt like so miserable. I've never felt like thinking this will last forever. They're just with me. You gotta tell them you came all over me. I never felt like so miserable. I never knew I'm thinking this will last forever. Baby, stay with me. You gotta say no, you left me.
I'd also like to mention the fact that some songs have got their samples entirely removed from them. The dorm track and the school track in particular feel completely different because of this change. Overall, I believe that in general games should take a very cautious approach to remixing music, and if you don't plan on adding anything to it, why change it entirely? What's the reason when a sample remaster can go such a longer way while still providing the original intention of the artist wanted you to have? I feel like this sort of falls into the Yakuza Kiwami way of doing things, and overall just muddles up the soundtrack into something that just does not have the same vibe as before. By altering musical direction and vocal delivery in Persona 3 Reload, there's a feeling of diluting the essence of the original experience that's created. What made Persona 3 memorable wasn't just its gameplay mechanics or narrative intricacies, but also its cohesive audiovisual presentation. The techno-infused instrumentation and unconventional vocals of the remake may alienate fans who cherish the atmospheric cohesion of the original soundtrack, even though that also had these influences on a certain extent. It's not really about the quality of the tracks themselves, which in my opinion are good. It's about maintaining the integrity of the original vision, which isn't merely about nostalgia, it's about respecting the artistic choices that define the game's identity and left an inedible mark on players, such as me back then. While updates and enhancements are inevitable in remakes, they should be approached with a keen understanding of what made the original work resonate with its audiences. Straying too far from that vision risks losing the magic that made the game a timeless classic as this one. And that is why all the changes amount to this remake being a step in the wrong direction.
しい微笑み悲しさ隠した瞳を